NRDAR Virtual Workshop, Wednesday sessions October 19, 2022, 1734 UTC. Recorded by and organized by Samantha Foster. Speaker, Karen Scurry.
Mexico Restoration in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Policy, Management, and Budget. She has received Interior's Distinguished and Meritorious Service Medals. She has previously served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance and as Assistant Director of the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement. She received her BA and MA from the University of Texas. Please join me in welcoming Mary.
ORNA Virtual National Workshop, Deepwater Horizon Gulf of Mexico Restoration. Mary Josie Blanchard, Director, Gulf of Mexico Restoration, DAO IPMB October 2022. Photo of a small bird sitting on eggs in the sand. Speaker Mary Josie Blanchard.
Okay, thank you. I've now been educated in terms of knowing not to sneeze if I'm driving a car in Tennessee. But thank you, Karen, and others in the ORDA team for inviting us to share Deepwater Horizon Gulf Restoration updates with all of you today. For this session, we have a panel of speakers from Interior. And to allow us to stay on time, we would like to go forward and answer the questions at the end of all of the presentations. Given the enormity of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, I imagine that many, if not all of you, have likely participated in some role in either the response or the injury assessment or restoration. And to all of you, I want to just say thank you. As you know, the Department of Justice and BP reached a historic $20.8 billion settlement some 6 years after the spill. Of that amount, $8.8 billion was to go to Deepwater Horizon NRDA trustees. Additional funds were also provided to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then civil penalty monies went to the Restore Council, the states, and the Centers of Excellence and Grant Program and the NOAA Science Program. But we're here to talk about NRDA. So as an introduction to the other presentations, I'm going to make a few key points about what makes the restoration process for Deepwater Horizon unique. Next, it's a complex structure. I presume it's the most complex of all of the NRDA trustee cases that have been settled. The Deepwater Horizon Council is made up of 4 federal agencies and 5 states along the Gulf. And there are currently 7 trustee implementation groups. They cover different geographic areas, 1 TIG for each Gulf state, and open ocean, which is all feds, and then region-wide, which has all 9 trustees involved. Next. The figure shows the structure. At the top is the trustee council, and the trustee council makes decisions that affect all TIGs, and the trustee council approves all of its resolutions, and individual trustee council members will approve all TIG resolutions for restoration plans and funding. For decisions like other cases of the trustee council or the TIGs, all the members must agree. One way we have addressed the complexity is to adopt the standard operating procedures that apply to the council and the TIGs. We have also developed tools that help us track finances, restoration progress, regulatory compliance, and other needs. These tools help us enhance coordination and communication among the TIGs.
Title Trustee Council, all trustees on top with logos and seals below it that include Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, United States, Texas, NOAA, DOI, EPA, and USDA. Then Title Trustee Implementation Groups, TIGs, boxes with text that include TC-TIG, LA-TIG, MS-TIG, AL-TIG, FL-TIG, RW-TIG, OO-TIG.
Next. The second point about Deepwater Horizon that I'd like to mention is funding, the timing and the rules about how it may be used. So when I tell people the work I'm doing, that I'm working on Deepwater Horizon oil spill restoration, most common comment that comes back is, how's that restoration going? But gee, I thought that was all finished by now. Except for the first $1 billion that we received from BP 1 year after the spill in 2011. The rest of the money didn't start flowing in until 2017.
Additional on-screen text includes allocated across restoration areas by resource injured. $489.6 million received in 2017. $489.6 million yearly until 2031. 2022 have received only 42% of total funding.
Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you. This is it shows you all the specifications that are in the settlement agreement and the consent decree, and it allocates the money by restoration type and by restoration type. So it's the TIG areas and the restoration type. So you can see how much can be spent on birds in Texas and how much can be spent in sea turtles in Alabama. And I know you can't read that, but I just wanted to show it to you for the complexity. Let's go on to the next slide. Note that we didn't get one lump payment after settlement, and rather beginning in 2017, we have received or will receive approximately $489.6 million for 15 years, with the last payment coming in 2031. In year 2, we received a slightly lower payment if you're sitting there with your calculator to try to figure out how much money we've gotten. There are many rules about how it's allocated, and while we're 12 years after the spill, we've received only 42% of the total funding. Okay. The third point that I'd like to make is the amazing progress that's been made from the Deepwater Horizon team in the face of all these complexities in both structure and funding. I'm constantly amazed by the dedication of hard work from the DOI team, which actually I probably expected because they're always so wonderful, but also of the staff of the other 3 federal agencies and the states. I'm very proud to have had the opportunity to be able to participate in and lead the department's Gulf Restoration Program. As I said, restoration project planning and selection occurs in the 7 TIGs, with implementation and MAM being conducted by 1 or more co-trustees. So where are we right now? As of the end of September of this year, the strategic frameworks, we've had 4 strategic frameworks, 32 final and 2 draft restoration plans. We've received $3.7 billion, commented on and committed $2.8 billion. DOI has implemented 32 projects and planning initiatives with an estimated cost of $124 million. DOI is also co-implementing 72 projects and planning initiatives with an estimated cost of $1 billion. DOI's allocation for this is 72 projects for $136 million. So next, I'm hoping that you will be ready to hear our very interesting case studies. Interior staff are the lead implementers for all of these projects and programs. Our first presentation about the Tribal Youth Conservation Corps program will be given by Harold Peterson. He's the Natural Resources Officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Eastern Regional District. The program for 6 tribes is not funded with NRDAR monies, but with the civil penalty money provided to the Restore Council, which approved this program. And just as background, the Restore Council is a federal agency created by the Restore Act in 2012. And that act sends some funds to the states and allows for projects that not only restore the environment, but also restore regional and local economies. Following Harold, our next speakers will all be discussing Deepwater Horizon NRDA projects. Each of these following projects was approved by the trustee council members and a TIG. The second presentation will be with VanMouwerik, the NPS project manager, who will talk about the Night Sky project, which reduces negative impacts of light in the vicinity of sea turtle nesting beaches. The third and fourth presentations will focus on the important concept of monitoring and adaptive management, which is a key component in determining our ultimate success. Meg Lamont of USGS will discuss the monitoring and adaptive management of sea turtles, and Dave Hewitt will speak about the monitoring and adaptive management of birds. The fifth and final case, excuse me, is our largest restoration project. It's the North Breton Island Restoration Project, and Luke Anthis, a Fish and Wildlife Service project manager for the project, will be able to tell you about the restoration success. I also wanted to point out that tomorrow afternoon at 3, Todd Hopkins will be making a presentation which was funded in part by the Restore Council, and it was created to assist decision-making and evaluating land to determine the best property to purchase, and includes a tool to analyze social vulnerability. Okay, next. I just wanted to say thank you, and on with the DOI presentations. Thank you.
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Thank you, Mary Josie, for providing that introduction. As Mary Josie said at the beginning, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat pod, and we're hoping to have some time for a Q&A session at the end. So next we'll hear from Harold Peterson about the tribal youth conservation camps. As Mary noted, Harold is the Natural Resources Officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs Eastern Region. Hi, Harold. And he is currently detailed as Fish and Wildlife Biologist for BIA's Midwest region. He has worked for BIA since 2014, coming from a NASA contractor in Huntsville, Alabama. He is a citizen of the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma and has worked with Native Americans since volunteering for the Reno Sparks Indian Colony in 2007. Welcome, Harold.
Speaker Harold Peterson.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me. Today's presentation, as was mentioned earlier, is on one of the projects that's being funded, the tribal youth conservation camps along the Gulf Coastal Zone. So as an overview of the project, this began with the Restore Act Funded Priorities List 1, or FPL1 for short. There were 5 tribes with reservations along the Gulf Coastal Zone that were funded in this initial project. By state, they were the Chitimacha tribe in Louisiana, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, the Porch Band of Creek Indians in Alabama, and the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes in Florida. Each were granted $100,000 in Restore funding. This was initially 2-year projects, $50,000 per year per tribe. Their tribal youth were hired as employees of the tribes using this funding for internships. The work was a mix of community cleanup and restoration, as well as natural resources education. Here's a map to illustrate to you some of the locations where the tribes are headquartered. Since this is zoomed out across the Gulf Coast and reservations are relatively quite small, they might be somewhat hard to see. If you look down into the right of the word Louisiana, you see sort of an orange area with a little pink dot. That is the Chitimacha tribe's reservation. You'll see several pink dots in Mississippi. If you see the one down close to Biloxi, Mississippi along the coast, that is the Mississippi Choctaw Reservation within the Gulf Coast Zone. Heading over to Alabama, if you start at the far north.
Harold, I think you went on mute.
Yes, that was strange. I didn't hit the mute button. It went on mute. So happened again. Not sure what someone is doing here, but I'll keep talking as long as I can. So start at the northwest corner of Florida, head just a little north and west into the state of Alabama. You'll see another little pink dot that is the reservation of the Porch Band of Creek Indians. And then finally you head to South Florida. You'll see several pink dots. The one furthest down in the middle of the state is the Miccosukee Reservation, and the others are Seminole reservations. So I'll go through the specific tribes projects from west to east, start with Louisiana and the Chitimacha tribe. One of their big projects was to build an accessible boat landing path down to Bayou Teche, which is a water body of historic importance to the tribe. There's an old Chitimacha legend that there was a great snake in the sky. The Chitimacha warriors fought it. when they won, it fell to the ground and made a indentation in the bayou in the shape of a snake. So that is the Bayou Teche.
Photo of a long black pathway with wood edges going through a grass field leading to water.
There was also a project for transplanting river cane. That's a traditionally important plant used in Chitimacha basket making. It's also an important basis of the Gulf Coast ecosystem. A lot of other bird and animal species use this for habitat. There were some river cane plants growing on a tribal residence property. Normally, a person would just see this and they'd run it over with the lawnmower. In this particular case, the resident knew that it was an importance to the tribe, so the tribal youth were given permission to dig them up and transplant them instead of having them be run over. This was definitely a physically intensive project. River cane, if you've ever worked with it, the root balls are extremely heavy and they grow laterally and connect to each other, so you'll have several root balls all connected together. Couple that with the fact that it's a summer project in South Louisiana, and it was definitely a physically intensive task that the youth completed.
Photo of two people digging up and pulling up river cane plants with large root ball and laying them on the grass next to a building.
Finally, there was some river cleanup. Bayou Teche is directly connected to the Chafalaya River, which in turn, of course, connects to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a source of drinking water. You see the building there in the middle of the picture. That's a drinking water intake for water that the tribe processes and then uses for their drinking and cooking needs. So another project of the tribal youth was to clean up trash out of the river and off of the riverbanks, and that's one I personally helped out with. It's one piece of trash. It was a soda can. I picked it up and immediately fire ants started streaming out, so I'm sorry to say that piece of trash is still there.
Photo of a building along the river that is on a wooden dock with small building to the right slightly leaning.
Heading further east to the state of Mississippi, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians had a project. A couple of aspects of that were education of tribal youth on the Mississippi state game and wildlife laws. If you look at the person just left of center, that is an employee of Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. The one just right at the center is Mitzi Reed, who was in charge of the tribal youth. And then you see some of the tribal youth sitting on the right-hand side of the picture. Another project we worked on was cleanup of a historic mound site, both removing trees, leaves, and debris from the site, as well as from a nearby interpretive trail explaining the historic interest and historic significance of this area. So there you see the youth working with cleanup at the site.
Photo of three youth working and carrying a tree in the forest with an adult on a hill.
Heading further east again to Alabama, look at some of the projects of the Porch Band of Creek Indians. They also did some work with river cane. It's also used by the Creek peoples in basket making. The river cane at one point no longer existed on the reservation, so the tribal youth were instrumental in bringing it back, reintroducing this native plant, so it could once again be part of the South Alabama ecosystem. So there you see some of the tribal youth working on the project.
Photo of two youths holding a river cane plant in a container in front of a plastic-covered building.
Also an important part of ecosystem management, both in the Gulf and elsewhere, is the use of prescribed burning, prescribed wildfire. So the youth were instructed in how to conduct prescribed burns on tribal lands. There you can see the fire itself is off camera, but you can see some of the youth there being on site and actually working on learning how to conduct one of these burns.
Photo has four people standing in a field of dried grass with trees in the background and smoke in the air.
Finally, we head east to the state of Florida. There were two tribes working on projects. The Seminole tribal youth conducted water quality measurements within the Everglades. That was a measurement of temperature, of dissolved oxygen, and some of the pollutants, primarily arsenic and phosphorus, but several other ones as well. In order to get to the sites, it required wading in water up to waist deep in boots that weren't waterproofed. And there was some sampling done on site with a sampling bucket, which I'll show in the next picture. First, the bucket was filled and emptied with distilled water to make sure it wasn't influenced by any previous samples. Then it was filled with emptied with on-site water. That way it took on the characteristic of the water of the site. Then finally, one last bucket was taken out and poured into the sample container. There on the left, you can see the sampling process, one of the youth holding the bucket. That's in the picture on the left. On the right-hand side of that picture, you can see me, my camera at hand. In the picture on the right-hand side, you can see the means of transportation by which we got to the site and relative sense of the depth of the water. It was very clear, clean water, so I was happy about that. Didn't see any snakes or alligators, so that was nice too.
Photo on left has 6 people standing in water with trees all around with one youth holding a bucket. Photo on the right has 3 people walking in deep water in a marsh. Date on photo is July 12, 2018 at 12:47.
Finally, the Miccosukee tribe, also in South Florida. A few projects they worked on, similar to the Porch Band of Creek Indians. They had a community garden, learned about some cultivation techniques, planting and maintaining the garden, and also the garden served to produce food crops, which were shared with tribal members as a means to help with sustenance. There you can see some of the tribal youth working on the gardening, as well as some of the garden sites protected by some of the Miccosukee tribal traditional huts.
Photo on left has 5 youth in a garden bed using tools to dig in the soil. Photo on right has a large garden bed with small plants and 3 large huts that have grass on the roofs.
And also, like the Porch Creek youth, the Miccosukee youth were taught some of the techniques of using prescribed burns to help preserve the ecosystem, learn some about the native plant and animal species that benefit from the use of fire, as well as identifying which native areas that have already been burned, so that way the overall ecosystem can receive an equal share of prescribed burns. And once again, you can see the youth working on how to safely conduct a prescribed burn.
Photo of 3 youths standing on pavement and one has a hose that is spraying water.
So that was the initial project. In 2021, we started an extension, which was an additional year of funding, not only for these 5 aforementioned tribes, but additional tribe, also in South Louisiana, the Coshawta tribe. Their project was revegetation along the Louisiana coast in locations that were hit by hurricanes, which were many. Holly Beach is pictured. That was one of the sites where they replanted some trees and other vegetation. They also did some revegetation work in Rutherford Beach.
Additional text on screen Cameron Parish, Louisiana. Area hard hit by Hurricane Laura. Wind gusts 140 miles per hour. Photo of a building with a partial roof and no walls. There is building and hurricane debris everywhere with an American flag hanging on the building. Photo credit Scott Claus, USA Today.
So in summary, a project was funded to help pay for Native youth to participate in these youth conservation camps. Initially 5 tribes in 4 states. A 6th tribe worked on the FPL1 extension. We currently have a proposal in for 3 more years of work under funded priority list 3 for all 6 of these tribes. Looking forward, we've identified some reservation land for a 7th tribe in the 5th state, the Alabama Coshawta tribe of Texas. So if and when we submit an additional proposal, we would strongly consider including them as well. And finally, the beneficial outcomes included improvements in Gulf Coast tribal communities, some on the ground, hands-on experience for the tribal youth in conservation employment, and some tribal youth education. So that's what I have, and thank you for your time.
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Thank you, Harold. That's great work that you're doing with the tribal youth there along the Gulf Coast. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Next, we'll hear from Mark VanMouwerik about restoring the night sky. Since 2002, Mark has worked as a restoration project manager with the NPS Environmental Quality Division. His background is in biology and environmental science. He began working for a National Park Service in 1993 in the Water Resources Division, helping parks with water quality and environmental contamination issues. Mark has spent the last 10 years involved in Deepwater Horizon oil spill restoration work. Welcome, Mark.
Speaker, Mark VanMouwerik.
Yes, hi, thank you. So, yeah, I'm a restoration project manager with the Park Services Environmental Quality Division. And I'm going to talk about the Night Sky Restoration Project, and this is phase 1. So hopefully phase 2 will come in the future. Phase 2 will involve the actual replacement and modification of actual lights on the ground. But to tee that up, we need to assess the current condition of light pollution in a couple of areas, and we need to make restoration recommendations for those areas. And the 2 areas are Gulf Islands National Seashore in the Panhandle of Florida and Bon Secour National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Alabama. The budget for this project is $918,000.
$918,732.
And it's going to be implemented by the Park Services Natural Sounds and Night Sky Division staff. So this is a satellite image of the United States at night. And this little strip, I don't know if you can see my cursor down there, that's the project area down in the Gulf.
Title on screen text is Alabama and Florida project areas, relatively thin strip of lighting. Photo of the entire United States at night with yellow highlighted areas showing the light pollution.
Zooming in, you see it captures about 75 linear miles from the end of Bon Secour National Wildlife Refuge to the other end of Gulf Islands National Seashore. When we're looking at sky glow, though, it'll probably be more like a 150 mile by 50 mile area.
A map showing the names of cities with a square around the larger area and small circles around the 2 test areas with labels for Bon Secour, NWLR, and Gulf Island National Seashore. There is a mile line marker below with label approximately 75 miles that's showing the distance between the 2 areas.
So some information on light pollution already exists. And one of these metrics is called the artificial light to natural light ratio. And this sort of confirms our suspicions. So you can see that Pensacola, for example, has 18 times more artificial light than natural light. Mobile, 23 times more artificial light than natural light. And the project areas comparatively are much lower, but they're still 6 times higher than natural conditions and 3 times higher than natural conditions.
Additional text on screen. Warrington, 14.28. Gulf Breeze, 9.28. Pensacola Naval Heiress, 10.45. West Pensacola, 16.41. Fulk Shores, 7.83. Navarre, 5.53. Pensacola Beach, 7.24. Fort Walton Beach, 10.60. Panama City, 12.86. Car City, 20.91. Gulf Islands, 6.08. Bon Secour, 3.10. Photo of large buildings on a beach, a night with bright lights and a few stars in the sky.
So the first objective is to define the scope of the problem, and that will involve assessing light pollution and their sources. There are 5 ways of doing that. The first is to measure the intensity and locations of sky glow. And sky glow, we've all seen it. It's the unnatural dome of light you see around cities and ballparks at night. We'll also measure the illuminance coming from those sky glow sources. Illuminance is the amount of light landing on or illuminating a surface. It'll measure spectral composition or the color of light. It'll measure the location of the brightest lights. And by location, I mean actual points on the ground. And then finally, it'll drill down even further to look at the types of lights and light fixtures. So satellite imagery is helpful on a gross scale, but only to a certain extent. What we really need to know is what's the light pollution situation at a point on the ground. And these points on the ground that we're interested in are habitat at Bon Secours and habitat at Gulf Islands.
Photo of a satellite gross scale with colors varying showing light pollution. There are labels for Mobile, Pensacola, Gulf of Mexico, and approximately 75-mile indicator.
First way to measure that is what we call the traditional method of measuring sky glow. So this involves a kind of a fancy camera that takes about 20 minutes to collect 45 higher resolution photos of the hemispheric sky. And this is done on cloudless, moonless nights. And this imagery is considered to be the baseline condition for a certain area or a certain spot on the ground. And it's baseline in that if you can track if baseline changes by using the same method at different points in time, different years, a number of years into the future, for example. So the top image happens to be of Everglades National Park, and you can see the sky glow of Miami off to the left. We're also able to subtract out the natural light, and so that brings the artificial light of sky glow into much harsher relief, so to speak. And these images collected in certain points at Bon Secours and certain points at Gulf Islands allow us to start getting a coarse understanding of intensity of sky glow and where the sources are.
Sky glow image on top is labeled Everglades NP East Cape Stable February 28, 2014 21.7 hours. LMT sky glow image on bottom is labeled Gulf Island NS Perdido Key Turnaround October 17, 2014 22.3 hours LMT and has a lot more white, red, yellow, and green colors indicating higher sky glow.
A newer method for sky glow, collecting sky glow imagery uses a fisheye lens. It takes lower resolution photos, one image at a time. And the advantage of this is that it can measure sky glow in a more dynamic set of conditions. So for example, you could take them at different types of cloud cover, different levels of humidity, different times of the year, tourist season, non-tourist season. And so this, along with the previous method, really fleshes out our understanding of sky glow as it pertains to our study area.
Circle image of sky glow with label for Desert Foothills Park, 2022 2/25 19.4 hours.
And these are the cameras that are being used. So the one on the left is the more complicated one with the high resolution composite image that it makes. The one on the right is the fisheye camera, and these are being used, in fact, this week out at Gulf Islands at Bon Secours. Illuminance is measured using this handheld device, and the picture off to the right is a great illustration of luminance coming from sky glow, which is the thing you see on the horizon there, and then the illuminance from that sky glow of light onto the beach habitat. And you can see that by looking at the shadows and the footsteps.
Image on the left is of the handheld device UPR Tech, showing the front, back, and sides with labels pointing to key functional items.
Another important characteristic of artificial light is the spectral composition. As we all know, this is a very ecologically relevant characteristic. Artificial blue light in particular interferes with fauna's ability to see at night. You know, this has obvious implications for everything from sea turtle hatchlings to predator-prey dynamics on down the line. The spectrograph on the left is an image of from Death Valley with little to no sky glow. And the image on the right was taken at Las Vegas. It's very high sky glow. Oh, and that imagery can be taken by pointing the instrument at a source of sky glow. It can be taken by pointing the instrument straight up. You can also point it right at a light and understand the type of color of light that a particular light fixture is giving off. So we take the sky glow information that really starts telling us what are the biggest sources of light near the habitat that we want to protect or maybe improve. And then we take it to the next step of investigation by putting a plane-mounted DSLR camera on a plane and establishing ahead of time what areas and cities and parts of cities we're going to look at. And they fly a grid pattern over these areas and collect eventually thousands of high-resolution photos that are stitched together in real time. And not only does it do that, but it gets GIS location. So every single light has a location associated with it. So after this is done, the investigators might look at this image and say, okay, these lights over here, they seem fine, but these lights here, they're of a color that we know is harmful. They also seem to be casting much more light than might be needed for that facility. And maybe they don't have any shields to prevent upward radiance of light. So then they make a list.
An aerial view of several buildings a night with a variety of different lights.
And with this list, they're going to drill down to the final level of doing street level lighting inventories. That's where they take their big list and their big map and maybe a big car and all their instruments, and they ground truth the situation of the lights, and they can go to the ones that were identified in the previous step and determine the type of light fixture, the type of light bulb. Is there any shielding that isn't there and should be? What's the brightness coming from these lights? What's the spectral composition? And some of this work has already been done. So off to the left, this is a comprehensive map of municipal lights in Pensacola. And also to the right, this is billboards from Pensacola.
Image on left shows a satellite view with lots of little dots that overlap each other with label city of Pensacola streetlights. Image on right is map zoomed in closer to the city and has fewer dot with the label 2 in each and the label Pensacola billboards.
And then the final objective is to define the scope of the solution, and the final report will give the results of the light pollution assessment, and then give mitigation recommendations, most of which will involve replacing or modifying fixtures, bulbs, shielding, adding dimmers to certain lights. It'll present the economic benefits of the new lighting and give some cost estimates for those replacement and modification scenarios, and then possibly predict changes in sky glow and illuminance at Gulf Islands and Bon Secours based on certain retrofit scenarios. And this whole thing is really just to sell the project and to tee it up for the most cost-effective possibilities in phase 2. Thank you.
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Great, thank you, Mark. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and now I know what's called that light I see off in the distance at night. So thank you for your presentation. Next, we'll hear from Meg Lamont on the sea turtle restoration efforts. Meg is a research biologist. Hi, Meg. At the U.S. Geological Survey's Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Florida, where she focuses on population level studies of coastal and marine vertebrates in the Gulf of Mexico. She leads multiple research projects on topics such as demography, habitat use, and movement patterns, particularly related to varying environmental parameters. Her research has focused on species that include nesting and in-water marine turtles, Gulf sturgeon, diamondback terrapins, and various sport fish species. Please help me welcome Meg.
Speaker, Margaret Lamont.
Thank you very much. As that great introduction said, I'm going to be talking about sea turtle restoration and focusing on monitoring and adaptive management. There are 5 sea turtle species that are found in the Gulf of Mexico. All are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Loggerheads are threatened and Kemp's ridleys are critically endangered. In fact, Kemp's ridleys are considered the most endangered sea turtle species in the world. The only nesting population of Kemp's is found in the Western Gulf of Mexico. Both of these species were considered injured in the spill. Green turtles are threatened and leatherbacks are endangered, but we had limited information about them prior to the spill, so assessments were unable to be made for those two. Endangered hawksbills are also found in the Gulf, but are limited almost exclusively to the southern Gulf of Mexico.
4 photos of different turtles' heads.
Adaptive management involves fine-tuning restoration projects, and in fact, can also involve fine-tuning the entire restoration program over time. As we learn more from the monitoring and we gain improved scientific understanding of these projects and programs. The process involves implementing a project or program, monitoring that project or program, evaluating the results, and then adapting to make sure we're addressing the objectives. Ecosystem level injury requires robust adaptive management, particularly for restoration actions that contain high uncertainty. There are both project level MAM plans and resource level MAM activities. The MAM process is unique to Deepwater Horizon. So here I'm going to talk about how MAM is being implemented to restore sea turtles, and I'm going to focus particularly on one project.
Photo on left is of the back of a turtle swimming away on top of the water. Photo on right is the side view of a turtle underwater near the sand.
To date, 50 projects have been identified for sea turtle restoration, with almost $209 million committed. Of those 50 projects, 10 are MAM projects with about $31.5 million committed.
208,708,492, $31,583,117 committed. Photo of the head of a turtle.
The one project that I'm going to focus on is called the Coastal Alabama Sea Turtle Habitat Usage and Population Dynamics Project. I'm the lead PI on this project, which was funded by the Alabama TIG. Prior to the spill, there was very little information available on sea turtle use of Alabama waters, and that made restoration planning difficult. So the primary goal of this project is to provide baseline data on turtle distribution and density in Alabama.
Additional on screen text. Capture, tag, and track sea turtles using Alabama waters to assist the Alabama TIG with restoration planning. Capture turtles using hand capture, dip net, tangle net. Collect skin and blood samples for genetic and stable isotope analysis, diet. Track turtle movements. Photo of a vehicle putting a boat in the water. Another photo of a turtle head and another photo of large area of water.
The project started in 2019. We put in 617 effort hours and we only caught 2 turtles. We weren't able to work in 2020 due to COVID, but we wanted to increase our effort in 2021 to see if we could increase the sample size. But after putting in 929 effort hours, we still only captured 3 turtles. So after implementing the project, we monitored and evaluated the results to identify ways that we could adapt the methods so that we could still meet the project objectives. We primarily evaluated the satellite tracking results. This photo of my employee holding the turtle shows a satellite tag glued to the shell of the turtle. When the turtle surfaces, the tag transmits a location, which is then sent to us via a satellite through as a latitude and a longitude.
Additional photo of a turtle swimming away on the top of the water.
Of the 5 turtles that we captured in Alabama, 4 were big enough to carry a satellite tag. These 4 figures show the raw satellite tracking data from those turtles. So raw satellite telemetry contains error. Those locations, each location contains error. That's why some of these locations seem kind of wonky, like the turtle was not on land. When we process these data, we will take that error into account. We satellite tracked 3 green turtles and 1 loggerhead. And the main point I want to take away from these figures are 2 things. First, you can see the top 2 green turtles did not leave the area where we captured and tagged them. They stayed in this seagrass bed in Perdido Bay. But the green turtle track on the bottom left shows that turtle moved. The green dots on the left are where we caught her. She traveled east over the Florida border through the Intercoastal Waterway and into Pensacola Bay, and then into Santa Rosa Sound, which are those last red dots, before her tag stopped transmitting. The 4th graph shows the loggerhead that we captured in the mouth of Perdido Bay. And she never went into the bay. She spent all of her time in the Gulf of Mexico in the water surrounding the Gulf State Pier. So after looking at those data, we identified 2 ways that we could increase our sample sizes and adapt the project. First, we decided to also capture and tag turtles in Northwest Florida. We did this because of those cross-state movements that we observed in that 1 satellite tracked turtle. And also because we have ongoing projects occurring in Northwest Florida where we know we can catch turtles and we could leverage that work. As part of this adjustment, we also decided to switch our focus from satellite tracking to acoustic tracking. Acoustic tracking involves the use of these small acoustic tags that we glue onto the turtle and an acoustic receiver. We deploy these receivers on the seafloor or strap it to an already existing structure, like a piling or a buoy, in the areas of interest. That picture shows a receiver, which is about 1 foot long. We put it in that steel cage to protect it while it's in the water. When a tagged turtle swims within about 500 meters of the receiver records its presence. And every few months, we download the data from the receiver. Any receiver will detect any compatible tag, regardless of who deployed the receiver or what animal was carrying the tag. So if we put out a receiver, we could detect any species that was tagged by any researcher. We deployed 2 receivers in Perdido Bay and 1 in the Intercoastal Waterway. Those are the 3 yellow stars that are on the map. And we found out that Dr. Sean Powers at Dauphin Island Sea Lab in Alabama already had a receiver on the Gulf State Park Pier, and he agreed to share those data with us. That's the red star on the map.
Photo on top right is of the tag held in a hand. Photo below shows a black tube receiver strapped to a metal structure. Map on bottom has 4 stars indicating location of receivers.
So the second adaptation that we decided to make was to tag turtles captured on the Gulf State Park Pier. Every turtle that is hooked from the pier is brought up onto the pier and then taken to a rehabilitation center. That picture shows a turtle that is hooked on a line and they drop a big, huge net and bring it up onto the pier. Turtles from the Gulf State Park Pier are taken to the Gulfarium in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. So we worked with the Alabama State Park System, the Gulfarium, and Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly Diane Ingram at the Gulf Restoration Office in Alabama, to get permission to tag turtles at the Gulfarium after they were captured on the pier. Then once the turtles are healthy, they're released back from rehab into Alabama waters.
Additional photo of the pier and waves at sunset.
So from 2019 to 2021, we caught 5 turtles. But after making these adjustments, we were able to increase our sample size this year to 15 turtles that we also caught in Northwest Florida. And that says 5, but we actually tagged another turtle yesterday. So 6 turtles now that we've tagged from at the Gulfarium and released back into Alabama waters. The 4 yellow stars on this figure show the locations of captures of wild caught turtles, and the red star shows the location of the Gulfarium. So the lessons we've learned so far for this project really highlight the importance of project level adaptability and of partnerships. Because we were able to leverage ongoing USGS projects and benefit from those partner contributions, we've been able to make these changes without any increase in the budget.
Bullet points under adaptability include: very little was known about sea turtle use of Alabama waters, have had to adapt the project methods to meet objectives, leveraging USGS sea turtle tagging projects. Bullets under partnerships include NOAA stranding, DISL acoustic detection data, rehabilitation staff, Gulfarium, Gulf World, Alabama State Parks, and Okaloosa County, Florida Coastal Resources Division.
And before I sign off and turn it over to Dave Hewitt, who will talk about birds, I need to acknowledge Diane Ingram again and Charmaine Pedrosa at the Fish and Wildlife Services Gulf Restoration Office, who have been integral to this project. Thank you very much.
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Thank you, Meg. It's amazing what you can do with successful partnerships. That was awesome that you're able to increase the number of turtles through those partnerships. So as Meg said, next we'll hear from Dave Hewitt on bird restoration, monitoring, and adaptive management. Dave is a biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Gulf Restoration Office in Fairhope, Alabama. Dave received his undergraduate degree in fisheries science from Virginia Tech, his master's in fisheries and wildlife from North Carolina State, and his PhD in marine science from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, a graduate school of the College of William and Mary. He joined the Gulf Restoration Office in 2020, having spent 12 years in Oregon working in the Western Fisheries Research Center of USGS. Dave's career has focused on addressing science needs for management of various fish and wildlife species. And with the Gulf Restoration Office, Dave assists with restoration planning for birds injured by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and guides monitoring and adaptive management efforts for birds and other injured species. Welcome, Dave.
Speaker Dave Hewitt.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Yes.
Speaker Dave Hewitt.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Karen. Thanks to Meg for setting the stage on monitoring and adaptive management. I'm happy to have the chance this afternoon to tell you a brief overview of how the trustees are working together to select and evaluate restoration for another important resource, birds that were injured by the spill. And like Meg, we'll describe a little bit of how we're using monitoring and adaptive management in our work. Let's see. I think Nancy Ann, if you can advance the slide for me. Or I can do the take control, hang on. Is everybody seeing the oil spill bird injury slide?
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Yes.
Speaker Dave Hewitt.
Great, thanks. So it's no surprise to anyone here today that the size and duration of the Deepwater Horizon spill resulted in injuries to birds along the Gulf Coast like never before, including major impacts to a variety of habitats that are used for breeding, foraging, and loafing. Birds were killed and affected directly by the oil in the environment, and also the effects on habitats have led to longer-term implications for nesting and breeding productivity. The trustees documented injury to 93 different species, more than 50,000 individual birds, but the true impact to birds from this ecosystem level effect of the spill is undoubtedly greater than these numbers indicate. The diversity of injured bird species and the habitats they rely on means that restoration is going to be a complex and varied portfolio of projects. Examples of the different habitats include habitats like barrier islands, key nesting habitats for pelicans, wading birds, terns, and nearshore seabirds, coastal habitats and offshore waters that serve as foraging and overwintering habitat for shorebirds and seabirds, such as northern gannets, and rails, waterfowl, and other land birds that depend on coastal marshes.
Additional on-screen text includes osprey, gulls, marsh birds, terns, wading birds, cormorants, waterfowl, common loon, and land birds. Photo on top right has two birds in water next to a plastic and wood wall with a metal opening that has netting. Photo below shows a bird covered in oil.
So over $400 million was allocated across the 7 different TIGs for bird restoration, and the variety of species and habitats that are involved has led to projects and activities of widely different size and scope and an array of techniques. And so to help guide that work, all the trustees collaborated earlier on a strategic framework for bird restoration, and that focuses on objectives and techniques addressing things like protecting and improving habitats, reducing direct and incidental mortality, and increasing breeding success. And to do this, of course, this restoration, it takes partnerships within DOI among all of the trustees and especially the states, as well as NGOs and a great number of partners depending on the type and location of project. Some examples of the restoration techniques that have been implemented in projects so far include things like stewardship of coastal nesting areas to protect the nesting shorebirds and nearshore seabirds like black skimmers and least terns, restoration of islands that are used by colonial water birds in states, especially Texas and Louisiana, and acquisition and conservation of other important habitats. So to date, the trustees have implemented stewardship projects in nearly all of the states for shorebirds and nearshore seabirds, have put over 20 bird habitat restoration projects into construction, and have finalized a number of acquisitions focused on specific bird habitat. And finally, we always look for ways to leverage our restoration work with that of other programs like Restore, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, and NACA funding through the North American Wetlands Conservation Act.
Photo on top right side is a bird flying. Below is a photo of a small bird in the sand. Last photo has several different birds, nests with eggs, in a grass marsh area with water in the background.
As Meg mentioned, monitoring and adaptive management, or what we call MAM, is a key element of the Deepwater Horizon program, using science to guide decision-making about the restoration portfolio. We do evaluations of the benefits from completed and ongoing projects, guide future efforts, and weave together an integrated story of the ecosystem benefits of the restoration program. Examples of specific information needs that we address with birds include things like the habitats and life stages that we should focus on, the scale and distribution of threats to those birds, and indirect benefits to birds from a variety of habitat restoration projects, such as marsh creation projects. And similar to the restoration work, our monitoring and adaptive management efforts also benefit from coordination with other programs, such as the NOAA Restore Science Program and efforts of the regional bird joint ventures. So related to what I mentioned about the indirect benefits to birds of habitat restoration projects, like marsh creation, the Louisiana TIG is currently wrapping up an activity to address just that in connection with the incredible amount of habitat projects they're doing in that state. This effort assembled information on breeding habitat needs across 3 different guilds of birds: shrub nesters like brown pelicans that nest in shrubby vegetation, ground nesters like terns and shorebirds, and marsh nesters like rails, grebes, and waterfowl. The habitat information will inform design for coastal restoration projects to provide habitat benefits for a suite of species. And a specific focus is being placed on targeted studies and project monitoring that will be incorporated for 2 main purposes. The first is to fill gaps in our understanding of the habitat needs for some species. And then 2, monitoring will allow us to evaluate the effectiveness of the design elements that are incorporated and adjust into the future as we learn what works and maybe what doesn't. And the project-specific monitoring will be combined with data from contextual coastwide monitoring, which is an example of what we refer to as resource level MAM.
Photo on lower left is of a marsh land. Diagram on right displays the coast-wide high-level ongoing monitoring with 3 boxes with labels that include current state of the science, preferential habitat considerations for bird nesting, project design considerations, and lessons learned from the implemented projects. There are arrows showing loops that include targeted studies, targeted project monitoring, and adaptive management.
So resource level MAM includes activities that gather data and information that we need for restoration planning and assessment beyond the scale of an individual project. For birds, examples of this kind of work include assessments of regional population conditions, movement and dispersal of birds along the coast, and the scale and distribution of the threats to the focal species. So in the Louisiana, somebody speaking. I thought I heard somebody, sorry. So like in the Louisiana example from the previous slide, the coastwide surveys of colonial nesting birds provides context on population conditions and movement across all of the project areas and beyond.
Photo of a sunset with seagrass on the dunes.
So going a step further, the effort in Louisiana has been replicated now at the full Gulf Coast scale in an activity that's now nearing completion through the region-wide TIG. This involves surveys from fixed-wing aircraft from Texas all the way to Florida, covering hundreds of waterbird colonies. These surveys are done as shown in the photo there at the top right, with high-resolution photos being taken out the belly of a plane, capturing images like those at the lower right, showing nesting colonies here of pelicans and terns. And these high-resolution images are carefully dotted to identify and count the number of nesting birds of each species that's present. And combined across all the images for each of the colonies, the work provides a snapshot counts of nesting activities for birds like pelicans, terns, gulls, wading birds in particular. And this activity was done, or this type of work was done during spill assessment in 2010 to 2013. It was repeated in 2015 and most recently completed in 2021. And this high-level data on status and distribution provides coast-wide context for our assessment of restoration of injured waterbirds. The project also has allowed us to consider development of methods for efficient analysis of this type of imagery. It's a huge task. Where and how we might use drones in some cases for efficiency, and what type of targeted studies we might need on visibility or detection of the different species using different methods. And it's probably no surprise that some pretty interesting things show up in the many thousands of images that are generated from these colonial waterbird surveys. Here's an example from High Island, Texas. This is a colony of wading birds, especially great egrets, that nest in shrubby vegetation. And I'm not sure if everyone can see, but at the top right of that image, there is an alligator that has grabbed a great egret chick from the nesting area and is taking it to the water at the top of the picture there. So you get to see all sorts of things, even nature in action in these images. I'm going to skip this next slide, so go real quick just to save us a little bit of time for some questions here. Similar to the broad scale surveys on colonial waterbirds, the open ocean TIG is going to begin next year with an activity to survey seabirds in the open waters of the Gulf. Because these species just spend very little time near land and data is very limited, this activity is going to fill a data gap important to the TIG's planning for restoration. These species include storm petrels, shearwaters, terns, boobies, frigate birds, gannets, and some of my favorites, the tropic birds like the one at the lower right. The new data will form a baseline to evaluate future restoration, and importantly, will guide the open ocean TIG on how and where to undertake projects that would address threats like fisheries bycatch and impacts from energy, infrastructure, and development. Also note that for seabirds, because some of the birds injured in the open waters of the Gulf are highly migratory and don't nest along the Gulf Coast, the open ocean TIG is conducting some restoration well away from the Gulf Coast in order to best restore for the injury to those species. So for example, one project is acquiring easements on wetland habitats. That's important breeding areas for black terns in the prairie potholes in the Dakotas, and another is protecting common loons in Minnesota from the dangers of lead-based fishing tackle and protecting nesting habitat for loons as well. And the open ocean TIG is currently working on a plan for restoring nesting habitat for other oceanic seabirds like northern gannets, which nest in eastern Canada, and species like frigate birds and boobies and tropic birds that nest in the Caribbean.
Photo in upper right corner has 3 people on a boat looking out of telescopes over the water. Photo below is of bird flying. Next photo is a group of birds flying. Last photo of tropic bird.
So in addition to the broader resource level MAM activities, each of the bird restoration projects has monitoring designed to evaluate project performance against objectives like increasing breeding success. And for specific resources like birds, the trustees try to identify ways to be consistent across projects so we can tell an integrated story of our progress. And to help with that, a group known as the Cross-TIG MAM Working Group, at the direction of the Trustee Council, developed a MAM manual that provides guidance on performance monitoring for different restoration techniques. And for birds, the focus of performance measures include things like counts of the number of nests or breeding pairs and fledging success. And they may also include surveys for non-breeding habitat use for foraging, migration stopovers, or overwintering. And lastly, projects include monitoring to identify threats to project success and help the trustees decide on potential corrective actions for factors like things like human disturbance or predators that would kill or nesting birds or their chicks. And that is all. Thank you.
Photo in upper right corner of several pelicans nesting with young birds. Next photo is a black bird in a grass area on the water's edge.
And I will click the stop, Karen, to hand it back.
Speaker, Karen Scurry.
I don't think you have to click stop. I think that Luke can just take it.
Speaker, Dave Hewitt.
Oh, that's
too
right.
late.
That's right. We already did that. Sorry.
Speaker, Karen Scurry.
That's all right.
Actually,
Sam can reshare.
Speaker, Dave Hewitt.
So Nancy, and I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
We did that.
Speaker, Karen Scurry.
Thank you, Dave. I think that's great work that you all are doing with bird restoration across the various TIGs. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Luke Anthis on the North Breton Island restoration. Hi, Luke, and welcome. Luke is a fish and wildlife biologist and project manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Gulf Restoration Office in Fairhope, Alabama. He manages restoration projects such as island construction, living shoreline construction, land acquisition, and oversight of data collection efforts across Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. He has been with the Gulf Restoration Office for 2 years and holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Policy Analysis and Planning from the University of California at Davis. And Luke, as soon as Sam can bring this presentation back up, we'll let you have the floor. Sam, I don't know, are you able to reshare the presentation?
Speaker, Samantha Foster.
Yeah, it looks like it's loading. 1 second, let me see if it'll load a little faster.
Speaker, Luke Anthis.
So yeah, thanks everyone. My name is Luke Anthis. I'm a project manager with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Gulf Restoration Office, and today I'm going to be talking about our experience on the North Breton Island restoration project. So, oh, that's something completely different. Next slide. Okay, I'll just keep going. Breton Island is a barrier island located 63 miles southeast of New Orleans. It is part of the Breton National Wildlife Refuge and is a component of the Chandeleur Barrier Island chain. Next. But anyway, moving on to the background. So North Breton Island is recognized as a globally important bird area. It hosts one of Louisiana's largest historical brown pelican nesting colonies and provides nesting and foraging habitat for pelicans, terns, skimmers, gulls, and other shorebird species. When the Deepwater Horizon spill occurred, it impacted more than 90 different species across all 5 Gulf Coast states, including tens of thousands of brown pelicans. North Breton Island being understood as a significant habitat for these impacted species was identified as ideal for restoration. Next.
Screen is in presenter mode, with a photo on the left that is an aerial view of the North Breton Island. Next slide image is in the upper right with a photo of pelicans. Next slide is shown on the right with notes below it that include part of Breton National Wildlife Refuge in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. It is at the southern tip of the Chandeleur Barrier Island chain. Speaker, Karen Scurry.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but I can try to share my screen. You just won't be able to take control.
Speaker, Luke Anthis.
Okay, sorry.
Speaker, Karen Scurry.
Are you seeing my screen now?
Speaker, Luke Anthis.
There we go, that'll do. All right, so prior to restoration, the island was approximately 290 acres, with the majority of it being no more than about 2 to 3 feet above sea level, with a small portion reaching 5 feet above sea level. It had a length of 10,000 feet. It was lightly vegetated with black mangrove and marsh vegetation, and the staff from Breton National Wildlife Refuge who conducted surveys on the island identified that there was a declining population of nesting birds starting in the 90s and continuing into the 2010s. So there's that negative trend.
Aerial view of the North Breton Island.
And this photo here was taken in September 2020, right after Hurricane Sally. Oh, there we go. And this shows the challenges facing Breton, mainly the loss of habitat due to sea level rise, regular erosion, as well as storm events. So given these conditions, the purpose of the project was identified to extend island longevity and resilience by physically building up the island through the placement of fill material. By doing this, we would provide additional nesting and foraging habitat for the impacted species, which would then contribute to their recovery. Next. So moving on to the engineering and design work, in 2014, an agreement was reached between the U.S. government and BP. As a part of that agreement, $72 million in funding was secured for the Breton Island project. Design work began in 2014 and preliminary designs were completed in 2017. The preliminary designs had the target of extending the island from 290 acres to 370 acres. However, starting in 2017 and continuing into 2018, a separate NRDAR settlement was being negotiated for a 2005 oil spill that occurred in Breton Sound. This was the Hess oil spill settlement. So due to the overlap in the impacted area for the Hess spill and the proposed restoration area for the Breton project, the Hess trustees started evaluating a joint approach. Then in 2019, a settlement was reached for the Hess spill, which secured an additional $8.1 million in additional funding for the project. The purpose of that additional funding was to add 53 acres of mangrove marsh restoration to the final project design. 2019, the revised designs were completed, and we had a new final target of 422 acres for the restoration.
Image of the Breton Island with labels for beach crest, dune extents, fill extents, marsh crest, mangrove marsh crest, beach dune fill marsh fill, mangrove marsh fill, work area, probable pipeline, and settlement plate.
Next. So throughout design and continuing into implementation, partnerships were essential for this project. This included partners with different Louisiana state agencies and federal agencies like NOAA, who all were implementing similar barrier island restorations and shared their expertise, as well as partnerships with the Hess trustees who made that additional funding possible and also provided their own expertise to the project.
Logos for CPRA, NOAA, Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries, State of Louisiana, Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, USGS, and DEQ Louisiana.
Next. So moving to construction, it started August 2020 and it took a total of 507 days to complete. The primary work being done was the placement of fill material, and this was achieved by utilizing a large dredge to pump sediment from the seafloor 3 miles away from the island and place it through pipes and up and onto the island to physically expand it. So this raised elevation across the entire island, and as sections of the island were completed, then sand fencing was installed to help develop and retain dune features on the island. Throughout construction, bird abatement techniques were utilized to minimize disturbances to birds, and bird monitoring was conducted to comply with the biological opinion issued to the project. In September 2021, the project was heavily impacted by Hurricane Ida. Work stopped for about a month and final designs needed to be modified to account for lost material. Additional time and funding was required to place and pay for more material. However, these modifications fell within our established contingency. And then all work was completed and demobilization was finalized in January 7th, 2022.
Photo on upper left is of the sand fencing with a worker and construction equipment in the background. Photo on upper right is person putting up signs. Photo on bottom right is of the pipe pumping sand out with seagulls flying around and a boat in the background.
Next. So moving on to our results, On the left-hand side, that is a satellite image taken from February 2022. On the right-hand side is a picture that was taken of the dunes and the sand fencing from April 2022. So in total, we expand the island from 290 acres to 426 acres. This exceeded our goal by 4 acres. For some perspective, that's about 100 football fields that we added to the island. We placed 6.59 million cubic yards of material onto the island, and sand fencing was installed across the entire length. We're still in the early days of our post-construction monitoring. However, early surveys are promising.
Additional on-screen text includes 14,730 linear feet of sand fencing installed.
Next. So looking at our future efforts, we are going to be planting native vegetation across 282 of the 426 acres of the island, trying to establish a back barrier marsh, black mangrove, and dune vegetation communities. Then looking at long-term monitoring, we are going to be tracking the island's essentially shape in both area and elevation to track how the island is holding up over time. We'll also be looking at vegetation survival and coverage area to see how that's developing following our construction.
Additional on-screen text includes shoreline change, island breaches.
Next. So this is a layout of our future planting efforts. Here, the long thin stripe is the dune area, the dark green is the back barrier marsh, and the main reason I have this slide is to point out the light green area, that is the mangrove marsh restoration. And that entire area from the sediment placement and the marsh planting is entirely due to the Hess settlement. So I just like to point that out to put that into perspective. Next. So looking at more of our long-term monitoring, we have long-term bird monitoring where we are going to do twice a season aerial surveys and ground surveys to document area occupied by nesting birds, number of nesting pairs and nests, number of fledglings, and any causes for nest failures. Then we also have spring and fall ground surveys to document habitat use by migratory and overwintering birds.
Photo of several pelicans nesting with young birds.
Next. So looking at our broad applications and lessons learned, the biggest one for me was the kind of impact of utilizing the Hess addition or the additional funding from the Hess settlement. So the additional restoration that we were able to achieve was pretty impactful when you compare to how much additional funding was added. For projects like a barrier island construction, where you have this large upfront cost that's, it's going to exist no matter what due to the nature of the project site, the nature of the type of work with large construction and things like that. You have that large upfront cost that needs to be overcome. But to borrow an economics term, once you've gotten over that hill from opportunities like the Deepwater settlement, the marginal cost of your additional restoration gets lower and lower as you're able to tap into and utilize more funding sources. So just thinking about the type of restoration that was achieved with the Hess settlement, building 53 acres of what is going to be mangrove marsh miles off the coast of Louisiana, doing that for $8 million would not have been feasible if it weren't combined with this project. So another important lesson I want to emphasize is adaptability. This project site, it's a very dynamic environment. There's a large number of hurricanes and storms. In addition to this type of environment is extremely challenging for construction. One of the contractors I talked to during a site visit said it's the perfect environment to destroy construction equipment. You have, salt water, fine-grained sand. It's like a perfect slurry to destroy equipment. So you need to be prepared for these type of delays, as well as the need for contingency to deal with events like hurricanes. And then finally, there's the importance of partnerships. This is a very large scale project that requires a lot of expertise, and no one person, team, or office is going to have all that. So being able to reach out to partners at Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, being able to see how, you know, other folks are doing these projects and dealing with the challenges was contributed a huge amount to this being a successful project.
Photo of an excavator holding a utility vehicle up with a rope next to the water edge. There are two men in hard hats and boats in the water.
And yeah, next slide. All right, that's everything. Thank you.
Speaker Karen Scurry.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and for your patience while we figured out those technical difficulties. If I can, I would like to invite all of the panel members back onto video. I know we're over time, but I did just want to take one final opportunity to say thank you to this all-star panel. So if you could all join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. Those were great presentations. I think I heard in many of your presentations the importance of adaptability and partnerships. I know Luke ended with that, but I heard that consistently throughout all of your presentations. And what I'm quickly learning is that in the work that all of you do, partnerships is key. So thank you all for your presentations, and I'll turn it back to Christian to get us to break.
Speaker Christian Crowley.
Aaron, thanks so much. And thanks also to Mary Josie, Harold, Mark, Meg, Dave, and Luke for those presentations. It was exciting to see a lot of the work that's going on down related to the Deepwater Horizon. And I feel like these projects also really showcase the diversity of the work that we can do to restore after an oil spill or any injury to natural resources. So thanks for that. So we're going to take a quick break. Let's come back at, can we do 5 past the hour? Sam, does that sound all right for you folks?
Speaker Samantha Foster.
Yep, let's do that.
Speaker Christian Crowley.
All right, so 5 past the top of the hour and we'll get started. And when we come back, we'll have a discussion of participatory science and crowdsourcing with John Eisenhart, Chris Klein, and Judy Pollock. So see you at 5 past the top of the hour. Thanks.